Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Eric Huggan, the Executive Director at Homeline, and you're joining us today, Wednesday, October 13th at 1:30 in the afternoon for another one of our webinars where we've been talking about the eviction moratorium here in Minnesota, the gradual phase out of that, and a number of other topics. Today, we're joined again by Rachel Sterling, Homeline's COVID-19 Eviction Response Coordinator and Housing Attorney, and also Homeline's Managing Attorney, Mike Vraw. And so Homeline staff is gonna go through a brief overview of where we're at with the phase out, with the most recent change. But then we're glad to be joined today by Max Tsai, a housing stability attorney at the Housing Justice Center, who's gonna be presenting about the RentHelpMN program and some aspects of the application process and other related information. So thank you for joining us, Max.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So just a few quick opening things just to quickly share. Again, Homeline, we're a statewide nonprofit organization. We advise renters over the phone and via email in 4 languages: English, Spanish, Somali, and Hmong languages. And we provide some general information, legal information on these webinars, but we do encourage renters, if you have a question about your specific housing situation and how it might be impacted by the end of the eviction moratorium, please call our hotline and the information is there. We also have a variety of materials on our website. We just updated our phase out page with information about the most recent change. And I'll drop those links in the chat in just a moment as well. Also wanted to just briefly mention that we are going to continue our webinars and kind of switch them up a little bit, covering not just what's going on with the eviction moratorium, but bringing on other folks like Max and others to talk about additional topics. And so today we've got Max on, but then 2 weeks from today, we're going to be joined by a couple of people who will be talking about ballot initiatives, ballot measures that are around rent stabilization in both Minneapolis and St. Paul. And so you can register on our website there. So again, in 2 weeks, we'll be joined by Tram Hong, the campaign manager for Keep St. Paul Home, and Kanani Omar, an organizer with Minneapolis United for Rent Control. And then lastly, just a reminder, Max is going to go through quite a bit more on RentHelpMN, but the 3 major programs that we want to make sure that folks are connected are RentHelpMN, statewide COVID-19 emergency rental assistance program, the Zero Balance Project, which is specific in Dakota, Hennepin, and Ramsey County, and is a landlord initiated program. And then if you're in Ramsey County, there is a specific program that you can apply through the county, through the Community Action Partnership, Ramsey County, and there's some information there, and it goes a little bit faster than RentHelpMN is our understanding. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Homeline's legal staff to go through our overview.
Okay, thanks, Eric. Mike Vraw, Managing Attorney once again. We'll be talking briefly about the eviction moratorium off-ramp, along with some city rules and federal rules that might still play a role in the eviction world. To start, to recap where we're at right now, the Minnesota eviction moratorium is officially over. It was replaced with what's termed as a phase out or an off-ramp late June of this year. And we just entered a new phase, yesterday. Phase 5 is what we're referring to it as. In the off-ramp. And why don't we go ahead and cue that page up, Eric, if we could, and get us to the shaded part where we should be. Thanks. So how this off-ramp works is that landlords have been gradually, since June 30th, reaccumulating rights that they had prior to the pandemic. Many rights were virtually instantaneously taken away from landlords during the pandemic to make sure that tenants were allowed to stay in their homes and that they weren't penalized for not being able to pay their rent because they lost a job through no fault of their own, was sort of the overriding theories behind the public health solution that the governor came up with, and then it was enacted at a federal level as well. But where we're at right now, The part that matters today is that as of yesterday, landlords reaccumulated a new right. Now, you'll see that we have 5 phases that are already shaded, that have already passed. Landlords build on the rights that they're reaccumulating. It's not like they lose the rights they got on June 30th in phase 1 when we went to phase 2 on July 14th. No, they're just adding more layers of rights that landlords didn't have prior to June 30th. So where we are now in the phase 5 portion is that almost all the off-ramp protections are now gone for tenants. Most notably, I think, the 15-day notice requirement. Landlords had been required to give a 15-day notice requirement if they were going to file an eviction for non-payment of rent. That no longer matters, no longer plays a role. Landlords are also allowed to give a notice of non-renewal or a notice to vacate, sometimes called a notice to quit, which they haven't been able to do really since the pandemic began. And so that is a very important tool in the toolbox that landlords have that they haven't had for 16, 17 months. The only remaining protection that a tenant has under the off-ramp is that a landlord cannot file an eviction for non-payment of rent if the tenant has a pending application with the program like RentHelpMN. And that protection lasts until June 1 of next year. It's not a typo, June 1, 2022, when this law was passed. This session law is what we have. It's not technically a statute. When this session law was passed, rent help was seen as not being efficient enough, and everybody kind of knew that. And I'm still thinking that that's probably a fair assessment of it, that it's not efficient enough. I think even the people running it wish it were more efficient. But it was understood that if tenants were applying for this financial assistance, it would take time to get the money. And so we wanted to make sure that a tenant that had a pending application was protected and that hopefully the landlord would get paid as well. So that stays in effect. If a tenant has a pending application, a landlord can't start an eviction, nor can they proceed with an eviction. There's a clear 2-phrase inclusion there. The landlord can't initiate or proceed with the eviction at that point. And so even if a landlord has filed an eviction for non-payment of rent right now, the tenant could go apply for RentHelpMN, and as long as their application is technically pending, and Max will talk a little bit probably about what exactly that word means, pending, how to define it, then the eviction case has to get stayed or delayed or some other phrase or word that the judge or referee might use. But the pending application protection remains in effect through June of next year. But that's the only protection left from the off-ramp or from the eviction moratorium that is now sort of fading historically into time. Okay. As mentioned, go ahead and go to the next slide. We did have a 15-day notice requirement when a non-payment of rent eviction was going to be filed during the pandemic off-ramp. That is no longer in effect. So yesterday's rule doesn't matter anymore. The bigger thing that I think landlords are gaining right now, though, is this ability to give a notice to vacate. There's what, 700,000 rental units in Minnesota, and the number of evictions filed in an average year is maybe 15 to 20,000. Most tenancies don't end with an eviction. Most tenancies don't end by the landlord giving a notice of non-renewal either. Most tenancies end because the tenant gives a notice to vacate because they want to move somewhere else with they can't afford where they're at. They have a job that has them going somewhere else, a significant other that they want to be living with or closer to. And so most leases don't end with evictions. Most leases end with a notice by either the tenant to the landlord or from the landlord to the tenant saying, I don't want to do another contract. Our contract is over. And landlords have not been able to do that for a long time. And now they can. They could give a notice. They still have to comply with whatever the lease says. So if a landlord and a tenant have a lease that goes through next summer, for instance, most one-year leases end in the warm weather months, then that lease remains intact and the landlord can still only evict for a tenant violating a term of the lease. But they can't evict for non-payment of rent if there's a pending application. But if the tenant is month to month, which is probably the second most common lease in Minnesota, then a landlord could potentially give a rental periods notice. Sort of the traditional way that would work is if the rent is due on the 1st, which in most cases it is, the landlord could give a written notice, it has to be in writing, telling the tenant that they have to leave by the end of the next rental period, which is most likely going to be the end of November at this point. There might be some holdover terminology from the original lease. Maybe it was a 1-year lease to start and it rolled over and became month to month after the first year, where the landlord would have to give 2 months notice. That notice would be for the end of December, that they could give during October. But those options are back and available to landlords that weren't available during the pandemic. And so this is a big phase. Those of you who've watched these sessions, certainly since the off-ramp began, we've talked about which phases mattered the most, which ones were less important. This is an important phase, there's no question about it. And so landlords have another tool in the box to use to try to get a tenant out. I should mention a couple other things though. I mentioned city and state rules, and let's talk about a couple city rules that are important now. And they haven't really been important until now. Both St. Louis Park, a suburb just outside of Minneapolis, it's an actual connected suburb, borders on Minneapolis, and Minneapolis have during the pandemic both enacted notice requirements, very similar to the 15-day notice requirement that the state had in place in a lot of ways. But St. Louis Park has a 7-day notice requirement, and Minneapolis has a 14-day notice requirement. So again, if a landlord wants to file an eviction for non-payment of rent in Minneapolis or in St. Louis Park, they have to give this written notice first. It's a city rule, and we haven't, like I said, seen it really kicked around much at the court level because there's been this 15-day rule in place. And so it was sort of the first in line question that a landlord had to resolve if they wanted to file a non-payment of rent eviction, which they were able to file some of during the off-ramp in certain circumstances. But one key difference between the St. Louis Park and Minneapolis ordinances versus the state 15-day requirement is the state 15-day requirement simply stated that the landlord had to point out how much rent was due. Both St. Louis Park and Minneapolis require not just rent, but everything that's due. So late fees, any other charges as well. And so this is now something that a St. Louis Park or a Minneapolis landlord has to give if they want to file an eviction for non-payment of rent. And so we'll see how this plays out in the coming weeks and months, and how landlords are complying with it, which I assume they will be. It's not that complicated to comply with it. We've been told for years that landlords kind of do this stuff anyway, that they give notices before they file evictions, especially for non-payment anyway. So it probably isn't going to be a very substantial change in their business practice, but they want to make sure that they're complying with these ordinances. You'll notice that we have the actual sites. Pay special attention to St. Louis Park's citation. This isn't something I like to spend a lot of time talking about in these sessions. But at one point, this was section 8-337, and it became 335. So make sure you've got the right citation there if you're trying to look that up. City codes, as a lawyer, I can tell you, are not easy to find. I've looked at city codes for dozens, if not more, cities around the state, and it's always a challenge to find these things. So those are sort of the roadmap coordinates to help you find either one of these ordinances if you want to look them up. Okay, the last notice requirement that I'm going to talk about is a federal one based on something called the CARES Act, which most of us still remember. The CARES Act was the first big federal legislation package created right as the pandemic was really taking hold. Very bipartisan at the federal level. So at that point, we had a Republican-controlled Senate, a Democrat-controlled House, and President Trump, who's a Republican as well. And the CARES Act had many features to it. That's where we first saw stimulus payments, both to people and to small businesses. But it also had some eviction language in it as well. And it banned some evictions at the federal level. The evictions it banned were only for CARES Act covered buildings. There's no better way to really describe that than that. What's a CARES Act covered building? Well, it's anything that probably has a federal subsidy to it or federal backing to it from a mortgage sense. So it is defined as any place that's covered by VAWA to start with. So almost any federal subsidy that you can imagine, if the landlord has one of those coming to them, then the CARES Act kicks in. The federally backed mortgages like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, this is really hard for a tenant to know. Our best guess when we first started looking at this was maybe 20 to 50%. That's 20 to 50, 20 to 50% of Minnesota landlords might be CARES Act covered buildings. We're just not really sure. Mortgages aren't that easy to find publicly to figure out where the funding is coming from. So it's probably something that a tenant would have to do some sort of complicated discovery on if they wanted to make an argument about this. But why does this matter, the CARES Act? Because the CARES Act actually ended a long time ago. In fact, one of the key parts, the part that we're really talking about here is the eviction moratorium in the CARES Act, ended July 25th of last year. Again, not a typo. So 2020 it ended. But it had this 30-day notice, the second bullet point on your screen, this 30-day notice that never, as lawyers say, sunsetted. So just like the off-ramp that we're talking about, it has all kinds of sunsetting provisions. It's got key dates where the laws literally change on a monthly basis in many of the cases in the off-ramp. But the CARES Act eviction notice requirement never had a specific sunset built into it statutorily. And so it remains the law that there's a 30-day notice requirement. What this law said when it was passed was, because it was passed back in April or March of last year, hey, landlords, when July 25th rolls around, you can't just kick somebody out for non-payment of rent if you're a CARES Act covered building. You've got to give them a warning first. We're going to require a 30-day warning first, a written warning. And so that's much longer than what we have right now, even in Minneapolis or St. Louis Park, the 14 and 7-day notice requirements. It's much longer than the 15-day requirement that the state was requiring as well. So the CARES Act 30-day notice requirement is still in place unless and until either there's a new law passed to eliminate it or end it, which I don't really see happening at the federal level with the makeup of the both U.S. Senate and U.S. House, or some court decides to strike down this CARES Act 30-day notice requirement, which we haven't seen. I don't even know if there's an active challenge against it right now going out there. Maybe there is, but it's not something that's been in the news. So anyhow, a landlord in Minnesota probably still has to give this 30-day notice requirement if they're a CARES Act covered building. And it's certainly a defense that a tenant should consider bringing up. All right, well, I think, and I tried to make this as quick because we really do want to hear from Max. He's got a lot of wonderful information that he's one of the true aces on in Minnesota. So that is a quick summary of where we're at. We are now in phase 5. Actually, Eric, if you could just skip ahead 2 slides and we could just retouch on that fact, because I think we have yep, there we go, thanks. Yep, we are in phase 5. No more phases until, no more phase changes until June of next year. Landlords have almost every right they had pre-pandemic, except they can't file an eviction against a tenant or proceed with the eviction if the tenant has a pending application with RentHelp or a similar type financial assistance source. Okay, that's the summary. Let's move on to phase 2 of our presentation today.
Yeah, so I want to thanks Mike, and I want to welcome Max from the Housing Justice Center to our webinar, and to share some information about RentHelpMN and kind of the situation we're in with the off-ramp. So Max is a new lawyer, just I think graduated from the U of M this year, and has worked for Housing Justice Center and has done law clerking with legal aid and public benefits and family law, and previously you worked as an AmeriCorps member too in legal aid, is that right, Max?
Yeah, I was a AmeriCorps member for a year and a half at Iowa Legal Aid in Iowa City.
Hey, Eric and I were both AmeriCorps members as well. So.
Oh, awesome.
Mm-hmm.
So you started your career in housing justice quite a while back, and now you're in the thick of it, and so we really appreciate you joining us today and going through a lot of the issues that it sounds like Housing Justice has been fielding questions from tenants who are trying to access RentHelpMN, and so we appreciate you being here, Max.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So and for changing slides, can do it from my computer, or do I?
You want me to switch? I can switch it over. So you're in charge, or I can
Yeah.
press them.
No, it would be great if I could switch the slides.
All right.
Thanks so much.
Yep, I will stop that, and let's make sure you have. All right, I think you should be able to have access now.
Okay, should I start the PowerPoint on my computer then, and then screen share? Okay, perfect. Okay. Does that look okay to everybody? Okay, great. All right, hi everybody. So again, I'm from Housing Justice Center. So we're a nonprofit public interest advocacy and legal organization whose mission is to preserve, protect, expand affordable housing for folks. So we basically, and the way that we're connected with the RentHelp program is that we're what's called a field partner. So we don't do any of the administrative stuff. We don't process the applications. We don't make decisions on acceptance or denial. But what we do is that we field questions on the applications. We also help people with all steps of the application process. So we'll help people if they haven't filed an application before. We'll help walk them through the application steps. We'll help them complete an application. We'll also help troubleshoot folks who call our line and have questions about, so such and such is happening with my application, or, what's going on with my application. We help answer those questions. And if people have been denied, we'll help with appeals. We'll help give people more information about the appeal, or help them file an appeal if they need. So we also do a lot of other things at Housing Justice Center. We have a Renters Reclaim the Record project, which involves kind of access to housing regarding people's rental records. And we do housing advocacy, some tenant organizing, as well as some larger scale litigation. So general inquiries for that kind of stuff, the 612 number. If you or somebody has a question about RentHelp Minnesota specifically, call that 1-800 number. So I'm going to talk, and sorry, here's my personal email on this slide. So here's kind of the agenda I was envisioning. So I'll talk a little bit about the RentHelp application overview. I've given a presentation that kind of goes through it screen by screen. I'm not going to do that today, but if anybody has any questions about kind of an individual part of the application, go ahead and put that in the Q&A. Or, we can email, or you can call kind of offline there, with some follow-up. Then I'll kind of talk about what happens after the application. So there's what's called a pre-qualification letter. I'll talk a little bit about what that means. And then I'll talk a little bit about application statuses and what to kind of expect after you submit your application. Then I'll talk briefly about appeals, and basically what to do if your rental application or your renter's application has been denied. I'll talk about one common tech issue that we've gotten a lot of calls about that's actually fairly easy to troubleshoot, but can be kind of hard to see at first. So I'll just talk about username and password recovery for people who have lost either of those things. Then I'll go over a couple of FAQs, and some of them are a little bit of what Mike talked about, but in a lot less detail. So if there's, if it's something that Mike talked about, defer to what Mike discussed earlier, because that's more detailed. And then finally, we'll leave some time for Q&A. Mike and I can take questions after my presentation. And then I want to add the caveat that a lot of the RentHelp stuff, or I should say some of the RentHelp stuff, is just from our own experience. Kind of the user experience in RentHelpMN really depends, kind of the individual applicant. And so I'll talk about what we've been seeing at Housing Justice Center. But I see at least a few other field partners on the call, and it's really helpful to see what other things are going on. So if you've had similar experience or kind of a different experience, feel free to chime in the chat as well. Or you have a question about something that I talked about, again, we have the Q&A open for folks. So I'll go ahead and just, cover some RentHelp Minnesota basics. I know this is a lot of stuff that people already know, from RentHelp being established for so long, and, other webinars, community resources, etc. But again, it's just the COVID-19 rental assistance program. If you're eligible, if you're a renter, you're either, experienced financial hardship directly or indirectly due to the coronavirus outbreak. And then you can demonstrate a risk of experiencing homelessness or housing instability if you don't Again, what's low income? 80% of area median income. It depends on which county you live in. And here's Ramsey County for an example. Ramsey County, of course, is higher than many other counties in Minnesota. And then you can also see from this slide that the amount of income goes up depending on how many people you have in your household. Finally, documentation that you need. First of all, you need documentation for income certification. So you're going to need some sort of form of ID for the person who's applying. So the head of the household is what it's called, but basically the person who's applying. Most people use their driver's licenses, but we've seen people use, birth certificates, passports, just basically anything that says that I'm the person that's applying. And then, you also have to document that you rent. So that's usually a lease agreement. There's other ways to do it, but for most people, that's going to be a lease agreement from your landlord. There's also, you have to provide documentation that shows that you owe what you say you owe. So, some sort of ledger that breaks it down by month. And then documentation of household income for all adults, tax documents for 2020 if your income hasn't changed in the last year. But for most people whose income has changed, a lot of people use pay stubs or some other form of way to prove that you are income eligible for the program. And then I just want to add the note that almost everything in the application can now be self-certified to. So, documentation is not a limitation to applying. If you're missing documents because they're hard to get or something that doesn't really exist for your situation, or you're just in a huge rush because you need to get all the papers in, most things can be self-certified. If documents are not available, you simply just say, everything that I'm putting in is true. Under penalty of perjury, under all kinds of other penalties, I certify that the things I'm putting into the application are true. So even ID now can be self-certified too. And I'll go over self-certification as I kind of go through some more slides here. Okay, what kind of rental properties are eligible for assistance? Almost everything where, I think the general rule is basically like, I am a person living in a place and I pay money to somebody for the privilege of living in that place. So obviously apartments are in there, single family homes, manufactured homes, hotels, motel stays, if they're the applicant's primary residence, and other informal lease agreements. And then finally, it'll cover up to 12 months of back rent, 15 months total. So that's 12 months of back rent plus 3 months of forward rent for a total of 15 months of assistance. There's no limit on how much you can apply for. It's simply how many months have you applied for. So 15 months total. At some point it's going to be 18, but that hasn't opened up yet. And then secondly, if you have to have back rent still to apply. At some point, you will not have to have back rent to apply for RentHelpMN, but you do have to already owe back rent in order to apply for RentHelp Minnesota. Some people that may mean waiting until they're behind on rent to apply, but in short, you will most likely be denied assistance if you apply and don't have back rent due. Or you're only requesting utilities. So do not apply if you're only requesting forward rent or only requesting utilities. Applications for those will be opened up at a later date, still TBD. Okay, how do you apply? You apply online, RentHelpMN.org, or calling 211, or you can apply by paper via mail or fax. Include a cover letter or cover page if you're faxing or mailing. And then, the same caveat is that we've given a lot of times, it's always better to apply online. You'll get better updates that way. Your application will get in sooner. So if at all possible, apply online through RentHelpMN.org. Okay, and then just a really simplified overview of the RentHelp Minnesota application. Here are the steps. Step 1, look at the RentHelp Minnesota Renters Checklist, which is available at RentHelpMN.org/resources. It's one of the hyperlinks in that list of documents they have there. To the extent practicable, gather all the info and the documents required before you start the online application. Again, most of the documents that they're asking for can be self-attested to if necessary. Step 2, go to apply.renthelpmn.org, complete the pre-screening. Step 3, fill out a RentHelp Minnesota online application. And step 4, submit your RentHelpMN application once you get to the final screen there. Okay, and then step 1, renter's checklist. So it's a 2-page checklist. Read it before applying. It's available on renthelpmn.org. There's a screenshot of what it looks like. Step 2, pre-screening. It's 3 short questions. At the end, you register an email address with RentHelpMN. The really important bit is that if you register an email and you complete the pre-screening, it pre-qualifies you for RentHelpMN, but it's not a pending application. And basically there's no legal protection just for registering your email and completing the pre-screening questions. You have to get to the end of the actual RentHelp Minnesota application in order for that, and we're down to the last bit of protection for renters, in terms of you have to have a submitted RentHelpMN application. And so, pre-qualifying, again, can't emphasize enough, registering, pre-qualifying, that's an incomplete application and, is not a pending application for the purposes of RentHelp Minnesota. Okay, once you do the registration, once you do the pre-screening questions, you'll get to this screen. You'll hit this big blue button that says begin application. Once you get into this dashboard. Basically, so again, in other talks I've gone like screen by screen for this, but I'm just going to go really, really broad overview for this. Basically, there's going to be a number of different screens in the rental application, but the important ones are step 1, which is you put in your applicant info. Most of that should auto-populate, but basically it's the name of everybody in the house, the address of everybody who lives in the residence, and contact information for the person who is applying. The second step includes, and I should have put that on there, putting in the contact information for the landlord, but also includes putting in, requested assistance. So it's the amount of rent and or utilities you're requesting, the amount specifically dollars wise, what you're requesting, and which months you're requesting, going back to 2020 and then going forward. Right now you can apply up to January 2022 for assistance. Step 3 is income information for the applicant. There are 4 different ways of kind of putting in somebody's income. One really important, again, tax information from 2020. If your tax info is the same from the previous year to this year. You can also submit pay stubs, bank statements, other forms of proof of, this is how much I get paid. This is how much I make, bi-weekly, monthly, yearly, and etc. If you submit 60 days of pay stubs, the application will annualize that. So it'll turn that into a yearly amount. And then finally, and I just really wanted to highlight this, a really easy way to complete the income information is if you already qualify for what's called a means tested government program. So a really common one is SNAP, or subsidized housing. So basically, you've already sent in your income to the government. The government's already certified, this person is low income and qualifies for public benefits. You can simply submit the qualification letter, the letter that says, you have SNAP, you have, whichever means tested public benefit you're applying for. You can just submit that in lieu of having to grab like pay stubs or self-attest to stuff. That's a really easy way for a lot of folks to be able to income qualify for RentHelp Minnesota. Finally, step 4, which is going to be like the last screen, is where you upload documents. So you upload a picture of driver's license, picture of rent agreement, picture of rent ledger, etc. That's just the stage where you upload everything, and then you hit the submit button. And again, once you hit the submit button, that's when you have the protections from the off-ramp. One other thing that I always note too is that you don't have to use a scanner for any of this. You can simply take a photo on a cell phone and upload those photos to the application, or you can take a photo on behalf of somebody and then help them upload the application that way. Okay, I just wanted to talk briefly about self-verification forms. So this is a huge barrier to a lot of folks trying to apply for RentHelp Minnesota, is that they don't have one or more documents that they need, for a variety of reasons. On the right, I've kind of included a self-verification form, an example of one. If you're somebody who's working at a clinic or working at like a pop-up event, or somebody who's going door to door, or somebody, just a person who knows a lot of people that need to apply for rent help, you might want to print a bunch of these ahead of time if you're going to run into a bunch of people, just so that you can get those wet signatures at the bottom really easily for the self-verifications. So I put in the advice of only use if document submission is unavailable or impracticable, because document submission is better in the sense that if you're able to submit a document instead of self-verification, you go through a lot less steps in terms of like having the processor call you, in terms of having the processor request documents, etc. It just tends to go faster. In terms of how long does a RentHelp Minnesota application take, it's super varied, and we're not sure. It really depends on the individual application, and we've had some really complete ones that have taken a while, and some, basically though, the more documents that you can submit, the faster it goes, is a really rough general rule. And that's why, if you can submit documents instead of self-verification. But again, in light of not making it a barrier to folks, definitely submitting self-verification is much better than not submitting a RentHelpMN application at all. And then types of self-certification, here's a non-exhaustive list of things that you can self-certify to. You can self-certify to your rent statement. So you can self-certify to, this is how much I owe, and these are the months that I owe. You can self-certify, and same thing as a ledger. So you could self-certify to, here's the late fees I owe, here's the rent I owe, here's the months that I owe those for. You can self-certify that I have a rental agreement with this person. Many people do not have like formal leases with their landlords, or or the people who are, again, the relationship is, I live in a place, I pay somebody money for the privilege of living in the place. Well, sometimes that's not formalized on a piece of paper. There's a self-certification form available on renthelpmn.org/resources, from which you can fill that out and submit that instead of submitting a lease, if there is no lease. You can self-certify that you have no income. That's something that's available. And then finally, you can self-certify that for XYZ reason, I don't have ID that can verify that I am who I am, but I have, I'll fill out this form, and under penalty of perjury, all kinds of things, I certify that I am who I am. So even if you don't have, you or the person who's applying does not have ID, you can still self-certify to being the person that's applying. Okay, and here's the most common one that I've seen from our callers has been people who need to use the rent statement/ledger. People have less trouble getting a lease or a copy of their lease, or might already have a copy of their lease. But one thing that they might not have is a rent statement or ledger. What they might have is just a total amount of how much they do. So that doesn't break it down by month to month, which is really what RentHelp Minnesota wants. They want something that says, March 2021, I owe $900. March 2020, April 2021, I owe $900. June 2021, $900, et cetera, rather than, as of October 13th, I owe, $4,500 total, after adding everything up. Like the rent help application really wants things broken up by month. So here's the first part of the form. It's just 2 pages, but it's really hard to screenshot legibly. But basically, here's, you just fill out this information. And then this is the important bit. You can see that there's this table. If it's somebody who can't get a rent ledger from their landlord, you just put, month, so for example, March 2021, month, year, so March, 2021, how much rent do you owe? How, if the tenant paid part of that rent, how much did you pay? Most people don't fill out the rent paid by another program, but you can. Then you put in fees due if there's a late fee. RentHelp Minnesota can pay for late fees. And then finally, you just total it all out on the right. You just fill out this table in the way that's accurate to your belief of what you owe. And then you could submit that form in lieu of, so on that last, there's going to be a page on the application that asks for a rent statement or ledger. You can submit the self-certification form instead of an official ledger from a landlord. But this is a really common one that we see. People are like, I can't get the month-to-month breakdown of what I owe. You can fill out this form instead and upload it to the application. Okay, I'm going to talk about a pre-qualification letter. So pre-qualification letter is what happens after you hit submit on the application. And so this screen is not entirely accurate. I circled where it's supposed to be, but in where it says in blue begin application, that will say pre-qualification letter. Also, like the status won't be incomplete, it'll be something else, but couldn't get a good screenshot of it without accidentally giving somebody's information out or accidentally creating a RentHelp Minnesota application. But basically it looks the same. It just has a different status, and the blue has the text pre-qualification letter instead of that. But basically once you hit submit, once you've uploaded all the documents for the application, that's when you are protected by the off-ramp. That's when you have a submitted pending application, and you get a letter that looks like this, redacted to protect this person's information. But basically, with my kind of funky paint skills here, you can see what it says where it's supposed to be redacted. So you'll get an application, you'll get this letter, it'll have the application number on it. It'll say today the status is, for instance, it'll say something like pending initial review, or, awaiting landlord response, or awaiting applicant response. And then where it says status, and I block that out, it'll just give more information about that there. Then you'll see the second part of the letter, and it says to whom it may concern. You'll have the date that an application was submitted for COVID rental assistance through RentHelp Minnesota. So basically the date that the submit button was hit and the person completed the entire application. It'll have the person's name. It'll say moving on to the second paragraph, you'll have the person's name, and it'll say so-and-so has applied for, June 2021, June 2021, July 2021, August 2021, January 2022, for instance, is waiting to hear if they qualified for a program and how much they're able to receive. And then the last paragraph before kind of the shorter things at the bottom, where I have that red that red arrow and the word legal to it. That's kind of the paragraph explaining the legal protections that people have through June 1st, 2022. Once you get to the screen, once you're able to generate this pre-qualification letter, basically once you've hit the submit button on the RentHelpMN application. Okay, I won't go through this very much. Mike explained it in much better detail, but essentially we're in the second to last phase of the off-ramp. And basically this pre-qualification letter protects you, based on the stuff that Mike said, with the stuff that Mike said earlier. Basically, you have the off-ramp protection so long as you get to this letter, and you have this letter until you get a status that formally denies you. So going up here where it says status, the statuses that are like real denial statuses, the most common one would be declined by program. That's where the RentHelp Minnesota team has said, for XYZ reason, this person does not qualify for rental assistance. Now, that's not a final denial. The person still might be pending because they might appeal. But if they don't appeal, that would be a denied status, and they would not. That would mean that the pre-qualification letter does not apply anymore. Withdrawal is another one that's fairly common, and that's another status that's not protected. But almost all of the statuses that can generate this pre-qualification letter, short of those denials or withdrawals, are protected under the off-ramp. For instance, declined by landlord is different than declined by program. This is a really common misconception. Declined by landlord, that's still a protected status because that application is still pending, because the assistance can still go to the tenant directly even if the landlord declines the assistance. So basically, when in doubt, if the most application statuses are still a pending status that has off-ramp protection. Okay. Right, and denial looks like this is a status that's usually indicated declined by program. If somebody's denied, the next step would be to, there's kind of two options for tenants. So first, or people who are helping tenants apply. First of all, you can appeal. And the second one is what's called reapplying. So reapplying is easiest through the online portal, though I checked this morning and there's now a paper way to do it. But basically, this is an option that will automatically appear if available to an initially denied applicant. So, you'll get what's called a reapply button. It's that blue button that I showed earlier that says begin application or pre-qualification. Well, there can be a blue reapply button, and basically somebody should, if you're able to use it through the online portal, it should automatically appear if it's available. If it shows up on the online portal, you shouldn't have to wait 30 days. Normally you have to wait 30 days after denial to reapply, but if the blue button appears, you should be able to reapply, sorry. But explaining option one, which is an appeal, in a little bit more detail. Now, appeals can be done. More information about appeals can be found at RentHelpMN.org/resources, and there's an appeal PDF there. I've kind of broken down the simpler stuff, but that PDF has like the address, has a little bit more language in there about the appeal stuff. But here's the basics, and the important bits are that you can only appeal by mail or fax. You can't appeal online. Or over the phone. You have to appeal by either mail or fax to the program. The appeal has to be done within 10 days. I'll talk a little bit more about that 10-day limit in a second, but the language is that it has to be done within 10 days of notice of denial. And then there isn't a specific form. So, we've gotten questions from folks who are like, where's the denial app? Where's the appeals application, or where's the appeal form? There's no specific form that has to be used. Instead, a letter will suffice. You just have to state in the letter, who you are. So name, address, application ID. This helps the person who's looking at the appeal know, which application am I looking at? Whose, decision am I trying to review? Now, if you know why you were denied, explain, this is the reason that I was denied. Then right after, explain, this is why this denial was an error. Finally, explain, I'm eligible, I'm a eligible renter, I'm within area AMI, I have back rent. All those things that we said earlier were the criteria for eligibility. Just explain why you were eligible. And again, this can just be like to whom it may concern, put all the stuff below, sincerely, applicant. Okay, now a couple of things to note about appealing. So there's like specific language in the appeals document that's on RentHelpMN.org/resources that says, you should have received a written denial letter. Assume that there's going to be no written denial letter. We've gotten a lot of calls from people who do not get a written denial letter. People may be getting written denial letters, but most people who have called to us, wanting to know what to do after they've been declined, have not received a written denial letter through the mail or through an email. People do, but again, don't assume that you're going to get one. And again, this is in the decline by program status. It says, you're going to be sent a denial letter. Like, don't assume, you can start acting once you get that denial. You don't have to wait for a denial letter. We get a lot of calls about people being like, I'm waiting for a denial letter. Like, where's my denial letter? It's been X, Y, Z days. And, if it doesn't arrive, it's not going to arrive. Now, the language in the appeals also says within 10 days of the written denial letter. To be safe, submit within 10 days of when you see the status change to denied by program. Now, the most accurate way to check your status is to check, log in on the online portal rather than waiting for an email or a letter in the mail. Checking online is the most accurate way to get updated status information. And so to be safe, submit an appeal if possible within 10 days of when the status changes to deny by program, or I use that because that's the most common, but or withdrawn, or XYZ non-pending status that you want to appeal. Okay, a point of clarity is that pending appeal is a pending application status under the off-ramp. So, pending appeal usually, of course, almost always follows a not pending application status under the off-ramp. Example, decline by program. So the person's status is going to be declined by program, which is not a pending application status. Well, once the appeal is sent in and received, it'll be changed to, it should be changed, sorry, I should say, it should be changed to pending appeal, and pending appeal is a pending application status under the off-ramp, eligible for off-ramp protection like any other off-ramp status, like pending initial review, pending batch 2 or whatever. Okay, now this is the, I'm leading up to this last bullet, which is there's likely to be a lag between when the appeal is sent and the status is that reflected in the dashboard / applicant status / what people can see online. Now, the status for an appeal, so say it says declined by program, you know, and then you're an applicant or a landlord or a tenant, or, you know, you're somebody who's sending in the appeal. Well, the appeal has to, you know, especially if you're doing it by mail, the appeal has to like travel, you know, sure, by fax it's instant, but like, you know, if you're doing it by mail, it has to travel to the office in Bloomington, has to be delivered. You know, even if it's faxed, it has to go to the office in Bloomington. Well, the status isn't updated until the appeal is actually received and then like manually changed by somebody. So, you know, there's kind of a time gap between like somebody sending in an appeal, you know, they are appealing, their application is pending appeal, but the status hasn't been changed yet because, you know, it hasn't been touched by somebody. So, you know, there's an argument that that's still pending appeal because, you know, they are appealing, it's within 10 days, you know, if not for, you know, it hadn't been touched yet, you know, the appeal is there and valid, etc. So there's kind of a lag there and some ambiguity in between that. But long story short, pending appeal is protected and the status isn't always pending appeal, even if there is an appeal, you know, in the works and valid and pending, you know, for lack of a better word. Okay, so on my agenda, I just wanted to hit one more, a couple more things. So the next thing was this really common tech glitch, sort of, but it's a little bit user error-y in terms of like, but really understandable because the program, you know, some people have been, you know, checking their statuses for now 5 or 6 months, and, you know, a password and username that you create 5 or 6 months ago, well, you know, many people will not hang on to that, you know, because life happens. In short, you know, what if I applied but I forgot my username or password? Well, go to apply.renthelpmn.org is the most direct way to do that. And then, you know, make sure to hit login and you'll get to this screen. Now, to recover your username and password, you'll still need the email and or the phone number that was used on the original application. Go to this screen. You'll see in the bottom right where I've circled in red, it says forgot username. If you click that, it'll send you to the forgot username screen. Now, you know, enter into those fields an email or a phone number. If you enter in a phone number, you can decide if you want it texted or called. It'll give you a code, which I haven't screenshotted, but basically it'll give you a code. Once you enter in that code, it will display the person's username. So that's a really easy and fast way to get somebody's username. You know, a common question that we get a lot of calls about are, you know, I don't know the status of my application. And then, you know, one of the questions that we ask is, were you able to log in? And, you know, folks, for, again, those understandable reasons that I stated earlier of life happening, are like, oh, I created that a while ago, I don't know my username. This is the way to recover the username. And a pretty easy way to walk through it with an applicant. The next thing is, you know, once you get the username, of course, you need the password. You know, on the same screen as before, hit forgot password. It'll send you to the screen on the right. You type in the username that you just recovered. You know, it'll request a password reset to either the email or the phone number on the application. And, you know, you can recover, you can reset the password from the screen after that, once you enter in the code that you received either by text or by email. The only thing to note is that the new password, just like the old password, has to be a minimum of 15 characters, which is longer than a lot of folks' passwords that they use in normal, you know, for other stuff, but is just something to note that if somebody, yeah, you just have to make it at least 15 characters. It doesn't have to be like uppercase, lowercase, special symbols. It just has to be 15 characters. Similarly, if you have somebody who calls and is like, you know, I have my username, but my password doesn't work, and they tell you a password that's less than 15 characters long, go ahead and walk through the password reset with them, because it has to be at least 15 characters. So then you know that they have the wrong password. Okay, frequently asked questions. These are kind of similar to these are the same as the ones I've had before, but worth reiterating. So does my landlord have to participate? No. Landlord non-participation seems to slow down the application processing, but money can still be paid directly to the tenant instead of the landlord. What if I have moved or plan to move? Previously, if you moved, you'd be ineligible. Now you're eligible, but still a little TBD on the process. There was an announcement. There's a PDF on the RentHelpMN site. But want to note, in most cases, payments will be delayed if somebody moves. How do you check the status of your application? First of all, check your portal regularly. Again, log in with your username and password. Check what it shows on your dashboard. We field partners, so ourselves and other field partners can look up applications if the person has their application number, and we can get status updates that way. We can give status updates that way. So, and then sometimes you'll get an email notification if the case manager or the processor is trying to communicate. What if I don't owe rent right now, but I'm worried about future months? I said this earlier, but RentHelpMN is still currently in phase 1. So if you owe rent from previous month, you have to owe rent from previous month to be eligible for assistance now. And when RentHelpMN moves to phase 2, again, TBD, you can apply for just future rent, even if your rent's not past due. How many months for assistance? Again, 15 months, at some point 18. And then can your landlord evict you? Mike went over this in much more detail. And in short, you can't evict for the period of time that's covered by the rental assistance application. Does the landlord or tenant get a letter when they reach funding approved, which is a status that's basically like, funding is approved, but the check hasn't been given yet? No. In fact, funding approved can still be changed to a pending status if something happens during like the payment, like during some other thing of the review, like it could still hypothetically be changed. The only real final status is payment sent, and that's when the check is like out the door, basically. And then the really only real final status is like money received, in landlord's account, in tenant's account. Then that's as final as it gets. Okay, thank you. So again, general inquiries about, tenant issues, 612, rental records, etc. 612 number, rent help questions specifically, 1-800 number. All right, and then yeah, we just wanted to leave time for Q&A, and I did see that there are already a few Qs in the queue.
Yes, there are. Thank you so much, Max, for that. We all appreciate it. That was a lot of good information. So I'll be asking questions. We did get some submitted as part of registration ahead of time, as well as obviously there are some in the Q&A. There are some in the chat as well that it looks like people kind of asked questions and made comments. Just going forward, if you have a question or something comes up, can you please put it in the Q&A format? Just because sometimes things get lost in the chat and then I don't see them until we're, going through the recordings later on, and I feel bad because I didn't get to your question. So if you can just use the Q&A function. I think I've got everything that's in there in the chat right now, but going forward, if you wouldn't mind, that'd be fantastic. So Max, you ready for this? Do you want to take a break for a sip of water or anything like that, or should we just?
Yeah, I'm ready. Is Mike?
dive?
No, I'm gonna dive. And if Mike's here, I might defer to him on some of these more,
Sure.
less rent help specific questions.
Yeah, I'll do the rent help specific questions first.
That sounds great.
But yeah, we'll get into it. Okay. So we actually had a couple versions of this question. Kaylee, a service provider, as well as looks like Dawn in the chat, is just wondering what's the typical timeline on rental assistance application? How long does it take to determine once the application's been submitted? Any ideas on that?
Yeah, so it's pretty broad. And again, if other folks have different experiences, please feel free to chime in the chat. But you know, I've seen 3 weeks for folks, and again, that's only, you know, this is all anecdotal, and that's, you know, assuming a lot of things. But you know, I have seen a lot of, you know, people who applied in April, people who applied in May, and are still waiting on assistance. So to give the kind of, you know, anywhere from 3 weeks to 5 months, 5 or 6 months, is obviously a pretty broad range. You know, in terms of the determination, you know, people have reached funding approved, and funding approved, again, it's not a final one, but is, you know, pretty close at that point. And then who is informed? So the tenant is going to get, you know, pretty real-time updates in terms of like, if you log in, you check the status, that's generally accurate to where your application is at the time. Again, we can also do status checks and other field partners in your area. You know, Sherry makes a really good point. Like, you know, if you do know that you have a field partner in the area, and, you know, it would be difficult to apply, you know, or you've tried applying and it's just, you know, haven't been able to get through, tried applying online and haven't been able to get through, do contact a field partner in your area, or ask 211 to direct you to a field partner in your area. But again, yeah, just a really big range. And, you know, we have guesses for what makes some applications take longer than others. And, you know, some things are more apparent. But again, I've seen very complete, very thorough, lots of landlord and tenant follow-up applications that have taken multiple months, you know, for no fault of anybody there, but simply that the system is pretty backed up given the volume of applications, as those of you who have applied can imagine, and who have kept up with this and have listened to stuff on the news, etc., are aware of.
So kind of jumping off, Kaylee also was asking any thoughts. I know this is outside necessarily of your area, but any idea how long the funds might last?
Yeah, so you know, we're not, you know, we don't have the exact number, but we have been assured that there is still plenty of money, you know, still plenty of time to apply. There's no worry that the funds are going to run out. So yeah, you know, there's been some heard of things, you know, out there that, you know, that to the contrary, but all indications from Minnesota Housing are that there's plenty of money to give out, and there's no danger of running out.
Thank you for that. All right, we'll move on to a question. So I'm just going to grab the ones from the Q&A quick. So Wendy wants to know, do you help people throughout Minnesota?
Yes, we don't have a geographic limit for our service.
Fantastic. And just in case that was directed at Homeline, we also don't have a geographic limit within Minnesota as well.
And Max, I think you said this, but maybe you never did. You guys just work with tenants, right? You're not working with landlords trying to navigate the system?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, I would say you know, we don't have any like strict, and certainly if it's something where like a landlord would like help, you know, in a way that we could help their tenants, but we are tenant advocacy. And so, you know, landlords asking us questions have to should be aware of that, kind of like we're tenant focused and we're a tenant advocacy organization.
Have you held hands with both the landlord and the tenant, and you're all looking at the screen together and trying to make sure that everybody's, because it is kind of a partnership application in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah. And, you know, in that situation, absolutely. We'd be really, you know, and there's been so many great landlords and, you know, really patient landlords, because the process has taken such a long time. And, you know, anytime if there's a, you know, we're really happy to work with landlords to get applications finished, because it helps both sides. And, you know, landlords, you know, often, you know, we're working with tenants that don't have a computer, which is a big barrier. You know, and most landlords, of course, have computers and scanners, etc., that can really help with the application process. And we're really happy to work to just get those applications in, because that's just really important for all sides involved.
But a landlord calling you up saying, hey, can I get some help with this? You'd say, the only way we're going to be able to do that is if it's with the tenant.
Yeah, essentially. I mean, if it's something like, can I kick my tenant out? You know, I mean, in that case, we would ask you to contact, you know, in many cases, of course, you you might be able to, but we wouldn't want to advise on that.
Okay. Gonna go back to Kimberly Wood. Basically just had a comment saying that they were told today on the phone and by email by Hennepin County rep that their 15 months has been extended to maximum rent requested. So that's more to do with phase 1 and phase 2, right, Max?
Well, I think that would be a little bit different for Hennepin County, maybe. I mean, I think the assistants can kind of, rent help is a little bit confusing once you break it down because it's a partnership with the state and a bunch of counties kind of working their money together. But once you get into individual counties, things might be different. But as far as what I've heard from the statewide program, it's still a month limit, not a amount limit.
Okay.
But if people hear different from Hennepin County, Ramsey County, Dakota County, et cetera, the info might be different.
Gotcha. Okay. Alyssa is wondering, do you have access to view applications being processed by the state? Nonprofit people don't have access to view all electronic applications, and it is frustrating trying to help when we cannot see them, and 211 doesn't give people useful information either.
No, in short, share the frustration in some sense, but it's in the interest of keeping stuff confidential and making it so that field partners can't edit people's applications. We essentially have access to people's application statuses. I think one of the big things that field partners are really helpful for, that we do a lot of applications, we see a lot of the same issues, really good troubleshooting in that way, but we still don't have admin access. So we're not able to do some of the processing stuff, or we're not able to see communications between case managers and applicants, for instance. So there is a lot of limitations for what nonprofits can do, to Alyssa's point.
Yeah. All right. Anonymous would like to get some clarification, it looks like. They said, I believe you said that RentHelpMN app can still be considered pending and possibly approved and paid out even if a renter has moved. Is that correct? This would be a change from what I understood was the rule. Is this change documented anywhere? It can be found on the website.
So it can be found at renthelpmn.org/landlords or renthelpmn.org/resources. It is a change in response to federal guidance, but it's still being implemented, and it certainly would create a new application and delay payments. Most likely delay payments, sorry.
Yeah, it's my understanding as well is that it's if a renter has moved, they can reapply basically for rent arrears at a previous residence, but it basically kicks them back to the end of the line, right? So
yes, and sorry, Sherry's correct. If the communications tab is not broken, we can see communications. Sorry, mine's been offline for a while. Sherry's answer is.
Okay, you're talking about in the Q&A, yeah. So
yeah, sorry.
It's all good. I was like, what are you talking about? Sorry, yes, Sherry has made some comments, it looks like, and also in the chat while you were talking, I believe Sherry, it sounds like, is also a field partner in a different area. So has some insight into their experience as well. So thank you for sharing that, Sherry. So yeah. All right. Is it just your communications tab that's broken, or is it somebody else?
It might be working. Yeah, I mean, it's been a little bit now, but yeah, other folks have been, but they're fixing it, and we should be able to see communications. That is true. I just haven't been able to in a minute, but that is true.
Okay.
That said, if we're not a field partner with that person, I don't think we're able to. So you'd have to have the code attached, I think.
Okay.
But again, people's experiences might be different than mine.
Gotcha.
Hence the thank you for chiming in, folks.
All right. This one I think is a pretty straightforward question, and I'm going to link it with a different question we got pre-submitted as well. Anonymous is asking when this is kicked off. They said they would be help for homeowners. Any word on when, if that will actually happen?
Yes, if yes, when, that's not my area, but maybe folks from Homeline might know, or yeah, apologies. I think the answer I can give is yes, but I'm not caught up on the details.
I'm sorry, we can't give much more. We're renter focused in our office, so.
Yeah, same for us. So the only answer I'm able to is yes. And same for mortgages, sorry.
Yeah. And a similar, Mia, service providers, was wondering if you know if there are any potential funding sources to help cover the costs or back costs of an eviction for tenants.
Yeah, so there are ways to cover certain other costs besides rents and utilities. I would look at the resources and the FAQs on the site for the specifics. We don't do a lot of those right now, and we're just focusing on rent and utilities specifically, but the federal guidance and the rent help program both contemplate and include the ability to apply for things like moving costs, forward rent at other places, etc. Basically in the idea of housing stability, funding for housing stability in short.
I think Eric posted those in the chat section that you just referred to next, I think.
Yep, yeah, he posted the resources link. Yep, and there's a FAQ, and then also there's like federal guidance FAQ too, but basically, yep.
Yeah, I understand that like court fees are explicitly called out as being covered, but yeah, how that, you would know better than I, how that would actually be applied for, at any given moment. Okay, let's, do you know, is a commercial renter able to apply through RentHelpMN, or is it limited to residential tenants? Another anonymous question.
I think residential, but I knew this answer about a month ago, but I've been looking at other stuff, so I think residential. But correct me.
Okay, I think that's my understanding as well. Is this just residential tenants?
Yeah, I'm like 95%, but I was 100% sure the other day when I looked at it. Anyway.
Okay. Anonymous also would like to know if you have any inklings as to when phase 2 is going to start.
Nope, still TBD.
Yep. I know some of the other programs that exist have already started using their phase 2 funding, not just RentHelpMN, but those are different programs. So yes, results may vary with that answer. Anonymous is asking, is the RentHelpMN process expected to become more efficient? And the applications could continue to take from 3 weeks to 6 months or more to be processed?
Yes, my understanding is that a lot of hiring, a lot of training. Everybody's trying to get these applications pushed out, and a lot of people at Minnesota Housing working really, really hard to make that happen.
All right, Alyssa has another question. They're wondering, who can we send people to when the processors can't see the application, and 211 says that they can't view anything besides a status?
Field partner, in terms of trying to see other things and maybe trying to get the field partner code attached so they're added to our dashboard and we have more access to our applications that way. And then if field partners can't, eventually submitting that question to somebody at Minnesota Housing and trying to get an answer from somebody at Minnesota Housing at some point. So field partner, and then if field partner can't answer, they can try to get that question answered by somebody at Minnesota Housing's RentHelp team.
Okay. Yeah, Alyssa gave some context. They're saying someone had been in final review since June and has not been reached out to as to what they need to do to push things forward or what's holding up the application.
Yep, and final review is a status that people have been in. So there are things that you can try for troubleshooting, and then contacting a field partner in your area would be a good way of starting that troubleshooting process.
Okay. Thank you for that. All right. So I think that is that for the RentHelpMN. Oh, here's one that just came in. Can you give some more clarity on the role of field partners? Do they just take questions and pass them on to Minnesota Housing? You mentioned that they can't actually access the applications, right? So what is the field partner's role?
Yep. So field partners, again, so field partners don't process the applications. They don't generally, I should say, and they don't have admin access. So they can't edit process or already submitted applications in some sense, but field partners, if they have their field partner code attached, can help applicants upload documents, can leave notes, can communicate with the case manager. Also, again, field partners, even more than, especially like the larger field partners, do tons and tons of applications, have seen many of the issues in more or less the same form, and can help troubleshoot that way because given the application volumes, given the volumes of calls to 211, et cetera, field partner is a way to try to get individualized application assistance through the troubleshooting that we've done going up to this point. It's when we have a question that we can't answer ourselves, either it is some sort of tech glitch or some sort of issue that does require somebody with admin access. Or something that we're just not familiar with, or something that we're not, that's more like a policy kind of thing that has to be ultimately made by Minnesota Housing. Basically, those unanswerable questions have to go to Minnesota Housing, but there are many that can be troubleshooted by a field partner because we've seen many of the same situations, and in those cases, it can often be faster than waiting for an answer from a case manager, from Minnesota Housing, et cetera. Because we just are working with a lot of stuff on the ground.
Thank you. All right, and then okay, so Sherry suggested, can you briefly explain what the different statuses are?
So I can talk about a few of common statuses, and Sherry, feel free to pitch in with any that I'm missing that would be helpful for people to know. It is a pretty exhaustive list, and not all of them are necessarily used all that often. But I'll go over a couple like really common ones. So the first really common one, the most common one, is in fact pending initial review. So this is the status that almost everybody sees. I think everybody should see once you hit the submit button. So you'll say pending initial review. Pending initial review means that you've hit submit, you're protected under the off ramp for now, at least. And it's basically like, this is the status while you're waiting for a processor at Minnesota Housing to, touch your application, to like start reviewing your application, start looking at your papers, et cetera. So that's pending initial review. Of course, there's waiting applicant response, in which case, you need to go back into your application. Oftentimes, it means that there's a document missing, or, a document through something happening, was on the application, was no longer in the application. They need another copy uploaded on there so that the case manager could see. So basically, if you see the statuses, applicant response required, do go back into your application, do try to see what, go through all the pages, do try to see what might be missing, or have a field partner or somebody go through the application with you and see what may or may not be missing. Let's see. Another common one might be like final review, which is kind of a precursor to funding approved. So funding approved is like, for all intents and purposes, and for most people, everything's been looked at, law looks good. Just waiting to cut the check. Then there's like pending batch and some other statuses in between there, which all generally kind of mean like they're trying to get the payment out. And then payment sent is where the money, the check has been cut, the money should be arriving to landlord. If there's a long delay, it may be because something went wrong with check delivery with direct deposit, XYZ. Otherwise, the money should be going to the landlord and or tenant, depending on the situation. So that's generally, but of course, if you have a specific status that isn't something that I broadly covered, or you have a question about any status, again, 211 to get directed to a field partner in the area, or the contact information that I provided earlier for our particular office. And there's just tons of other field partners out there too for all these different statuses. But that's kind of the broad gist of the statuses, without getting into all of the literal statuses. The other important status, of course, is declined by program, which I explained earlier, in which case you should either reapply or appeal.
Thank you. All right, Anonymous is saying, why are we getting no response to why we are getting payments much smaller than what is authorized? This is a landlord, I'm assuming, just because they're the ones getting the payments.
And I don't have a good answer for that. Yep.
That's fair.
Yep.
Right.
I would, 211, or, if it is a landlord, landlords at RentHelpMN.org,
Yep.
I think is the inbox.
That's the one.
Yep.
All right, Kimberly is wondering, they're saying, I have a very common issues with apps. Our tenants are listing the wrong property owner address because it's the first on the list that populates when they type in the name of their property management company. What is the best way to correct this issue? I have emailed in many times and never got a reply.
Yeah, this is an issue for sure. So, as much as, depends on, of course, like with your tenants and, what kind of relationship they might, and obviously the size of the building, or, however many buildings, this may be more or less impracticable, but, asking tenants to let the list auto-populate and to not use the add landlord function if you already know for sure you're already on the list. Of course, that prevents, this is for other folks. Sorry, Kimberly. This is for other folks who may not already be encountering this issue, because I know you're probably already in the people, like tons and tons of listings. And this is a little bit after the fact, but basically that's the advice for pre the fact. Now, with the the best way to correct the issue, unfortunately, is that they really are trying to delete as many duplicates as they can. They're aware of the issue, and they do have folks going through the lists, and they have been deleting many of the duplicates. But unfortunately, there is an overwhelming, my understanding is that there are a lot of duplicates, and that it is really, really difficult to keep up, I would assume. So that's only from what I've briefly heard. We don't cover that area, but I would imagine if it hasn't happened yet, it's because it is very, very common, unfortunately. But yeah, I will say, keep trying that landlord inbox. We have been told that it does get cleared out every few days, and that should be answered. But we haven't experienced the landlord inbox ourselves. So apologies if they are not getting answered via landlord inbox.
This is Kimberly also is adding any suggestions what an owner can do that got a check made out to the owner, but for a property and a tenant that is not theirs.
Okay, there is, so if you go to RentHelpMN.org/resources, under landlord resources, so there's kind of like a bunch of subheadings. There is a PDF for returning funds, and they should return funds if that is a mistaken check. So following the instructions on that PDF. Yep.
All right.
Okay.
So, and then we have about 5 minutes left. And I think that's it for the questions I've got for RentHelpMN. Greg was a landlord, just wanted to make a comment. At the past 3 days, he's been contacted by RentHelp 2 times to verify the status of renters that they didn't have in properties they didn't own. say it's because his wife has a unique name, things are getting mixed up in their system. But when they ask about their own tenant statuses, they can't get help. So basically just the comment is, I'm afraid this is going to be a long and bumpy road. And I think that isn't wrong. All right, so thank you for that, Max. We have a couple of non-RentHelpMN questions. So you can feel free if you want to stick around. Otherwise, I will start barraging Mike with these. If you've got, for what we can answer in the next 5 minutes.
Thanks again, Max. Appreciate your time. Very insightful.
Yep, absolutely. All right, you ready?
Sure, fire away.
Let's do this. All right, so Lynette is a tenant and is saying, if I don't have a current lease and have lived in my rental unit for 12 years and now landlord will only offer a month to month, that gets cut off because of the word
Right.
count, but.
Yeah, so this can happen. People that are in a place for a long time sort of think that they have an inherent right to continue going the 1-year lease again and again, but the general rule is that's not true. The landlord could go month to month. These aren't lifetime deals that tenants have with landlords. Again, you're there for 12 years. A tenant starts to think the place is mine unless I make some mistakes. But no, it's a 1-year deal that gets renewed each year. And after each year, both sides can decide whether they want to do another one. And so a landlord could go month to month at that point. I would say that probably means the landlord wants to keep the tenant around. If they wanted to make them go, they just give them a notice to vacate. So it's not necessarily the end of the relationship between that landlord and tenant, but landlord decides they want to go month to month, then sometimes it can be negotiated too. Maybe they could reach an agreement where it would end sometime next summer. It might not be a full 12 months. Maybe it's just the spring, but the landlord almost certainly doesn't want the tenant leaving in the middle of the winter unless they're maybe hoping to renovate or something.
All right, Kimberly, Dean is a landlord. If ending the lease with a non-renewal and tenant has an outstanding balance, will that block us from not renewing the lease?
So this is complicated, but Dean's question is sort of based on the latest phase that we've just entered, where a landlord can now give a notice to vacate or a non-renewal. However, they aren't allowed to file an eviction or proceed with an eviction if a tenant has an application pending with rent help. So it kind of gets to the core of why the notice is being given. Dean mentions that there's an outstanding balance in the question itself. And so how it would work, let's say Dean gives a notice for the end of November. The tenant doesn't go. On December 1, Dean would go file an eviction for what's called holding over after being given a proper notice to vacate. And if it's purely for the landlord decided they didn't want to renew, I guess that Dean should win that argument as a landlord. But I'd be awfully careful about how I'm pleading the complaint. I gave them a notice to vacate to leave at the end of November, plus they owe a bunch of rent. Well, that kind of indicates that the real reason is that the tenant owes a bunch of rent. And so we don't know how judges are going to deal with that. We've never been in this place before. Lawyers rely on precedents, and I can't point one out to you because we haven't been there yet. So short answer is you have new rights because of the phase that we're in, but it's not a sure thing if the real reason is for non-payment of rent, especially if you're declaring that in a court document.
All right, thank you. And then now Kimberly. So Kimberly filed an eviction for uncooperative, unpaying tenants. Then they say they are applying for aid and 3 weeks, no proof of aid. Now what?
So I'm not sure if Kimberly's saying, hey, we aren't getting any proof of any money coming, no proof that they've applied for the rent help assistance. As near as you can tell, reading the session law, the one that's the off-ramp phase out, if the tenant produces evidence that they've applied at any point during the eviction proceeding, then I think that suspends the eviction proceeding if they've got a pending application. That's the only requirement that they have to meet. So if I'm the landlord, I'm going to ask the tenant, hey, produce whatever you can showing me that you've applied so we can tell the court about this. Maybe I can help get it going more smoothly, help with the application. Because I assume that Kimberly wants to get paid like almost every other landlord in the state.
All right, Greg would like to know, when serving the tenant with an order to vacate and the tenant won't answer the door, can the notice be taped on the door to the property? Is that the same as being served?
So Greg's question has got a lot of elements. It's sort of show that there's some knowledge here, but not total knowledge, and that's fine. That's why people watch these presentations. A notice to vacate. So a notice to vacate, non-renewal, notice to quit has to be in writing, and it has to be properly timed. There are no requirements in the law about how it has to be served, as compared to an eviction. An eviction is where we have a court case filed. There's a court date, there's a court time, very formal, as one might suspect. There's a court case. And those have to be served in a specific way. And one of the few ways that it can be done is if the tenant isn't home, the first couple times the landlord tries to serve the papers, not the landlord, their process server, then the landlord is allowed to put one on the door and one through the mail. So an actual notice to vacate, there's no formal statutory definition of how that has to be given. Is an email sufficient? Maybe. I think the longer that there's a relationship of emailing between the landlord and the tenant, the more likely it is that that would hold up. I think a text is probably not enough. I wouldn't bank on it, at least. And I tell that to tenants when they ask if a text is good enough too, hoping that a text they gave a landlord might be sufficient. Maybe is the short answer with both the text and an email. But no, I think a piece of paper sent in the mail, regular mail, is a pretty traditional way for a notice to vacate to be given by a landlord.
All right. And Anonymous had basically almost the exact same question that Dean had, but can a landlord not renew and not request back rent, even if a rent help app is pending? The basis for non-renewal is not because the rent is owed, but because they just don't want to renew the lease.
Yeah, so again, the question says, I don't care about the money, but I know they've got a rent help application pending, which indicates that money matters somewhere to somebody. And so it's a matter of how the landlord wants to plead this case out, is the way that lawyers would describe it. There's a lot of ways to phrase things on an eviction, but if a landlord hires an attorney, they'll probably figure this stuff out. If the landlord is just looking at the form, the court form that the court provides for filing an eviction, they might be thinking, because there's sort of this menu of options, why the landlord wants to evict the tenant. And there's only a few that are on there. The first one is going to be, hey, non-payment of rent. Well, yeah, that's right. They didn't pay the rent, so I'll check that. The next one is you gave a proper notice and they did. Yeah, I'll check that too. And they might check the next one down, which is the tenant has violated terms of the lease. Not realizing that they're kind of admitting that one of the primary reasons, maybe the primary reason for the non-renewal, is for the non-payment of rent. And so the pending application might throw that into flux. Again, we don't know how courts are going to deal with that until we actually see it. But it's something that if I'm a judge or a referee, I'm going to at least look at.
All right, and then a last minute question just came in from another anonymous. So basically, tenant is not providing documentation of a pending application. They've had other tenants who provide that standard letter that Max was referencing, but they believe that this particular tenant is just stalling, and they want to know, without proof, can they file an eviction? They just really want this tenant to pay. Or
yeah, sure. And I mean, I'm not sure that a landlord could be stopped from filing an eviction here. The landlord can go file the eviction. It's just that the court might say, no, this isn't going to proceed. If I'm the landlord in this situation, I don't want to file an eviction unless I need to. It costs $300 and you're not sure that you're going to win. And you might hire an attorney for it. So you might go to the tenant and say, hey, look, you know what? We've gotten other letters from tenants, and maybe use some of Max's blacking out names or paint that he used as he described it to shield the name and say, this is what these letters look like when we know that somebody's applied. Can you get us that version of the letter from Rent Help that you have? So we know that you've applied, because we don't want to file an eviction against you if we don't have to. It goes on your record, makes it harder for you to rent again, and it costs us money. And Max, I see you jump back in, so you must have a thought.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in too and say that, getting that pre-qualification letter, lots of folks have lots of tech barriers. Many people haven't been able to log in for, weeks, months, etc. For X, Y, or Z reason. Once you do get logged in, and if you have a computer or, etc., it is easy to get that pre-qualification letter, but, for many reasons, it's not accessible for everybody. So maybe it is helpful to, walk that through with the tenant and offer, to help them out with it if, because, and walk through that forgot username or forgot password stuff that I went over earlier, because that's a really common way people get locked out of their accounts and aren't able to produce that pre-qualification letter because they're not able to if they're not able to log in. And many people don't know when they apply to print that out or to have it otherwise.
Max, would that make sense for that landlord to tell the tenant, hey, you know what, call Max. He'll help you
Yeah.
produce
Oh,
the
yeah,
document
sorry.
that I need to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Call Max, call 211, ask them to get referred to a field partner, contact any field partners in the area, or contact any short of all those steps, contact a nonprofit in the area that may know a field partner, get referred to it that way. Happy to look them up and grab those pre-qualification letters if they're
Yeah,
available.
because you know what the landlord wants to see, and you can help the tenant produce that and get it to them.
Yep. With the caveat that if it's something where the account can't get logged into because we still do need application numbers on our end to be able to print out that pre-qualification letter. So just because we're not able to get it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. In which case, sometimes that has to get referred to somebody at Minnesota Housing. But in many, many cases, it's usually a case of a lost password, lost username. Person still has access to the email they used, the phone number they used. And so we are able to get to a lot of applications that way.
Thanks for that. Max, can we we'll put your information in the chat.
Yep.
So, all right, fantastic. All right, well, that is it for the questions that came through. So thank you for that.
Eric, do you want to take over, Eric, and repost our coming attractions as well to wrap up?
The next our next webinar, which again is 2 weeks out from today. It'll be on Wednesday, October 27th in the afternoon from 1:30 to 3. And we'll have several folks from Minneapolis and St. Paul who've been working on the ballot measures that have around rent stabilization in both of those cities. So that'll be the focus of the next one. And then over the next month or more, we also we're hoping to have on a number of other guests, including circling back and having folks from RentHelpMN and Zero Balance Project. So we'll be posting and sending out emails once those are confirmed and set up. So thank you. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Thank you a ton, Max, for your very detailed overview and all the Q&A you helped field today. And Max, all right, sorry, here, there, oh yeah, okay. So Rachel did put in the chat the RentHelpMN specific number at Housing Justice Center for folks that have questions. So that's in the chat. So thank you, and thanks, Max, again, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.